I mean, I remember the thought that went through my mind was, how have I lived on this planet all these years and never knew that this existed? And it literally blew my mind. And
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Juli Berwald. Juli is an ocean expert, science writer, and author. Her work has appeared in places like National Geographic, the New York Times, and others. Her recent story was The Mr. Healthy Coral Reef. Juli, thanks for joining us.
oh, it's a delight to be here.
All right, to start off, would you mind summarizing your intellectual and academic background as well as your work as a popular science writer?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. I got my PhD in ocean science in California. I worked on satellite imagery of the oceans. That was back when we were just getting kind of these big overviews of what was happening out there. And so I was working on how much carbon dioxide the ocean takes up through photosynthesis, which was a big question at the time. Now we know it's about a third of the carbon dioxide we emit from burning fossil fuels. And then I kind of rolled off the academic path and ended up writing textbooks for a little while. And that's where I really discovered that I love writing about science. And I kind of very slowly started writing little articles and press releases and things like that. And then eventually in 2017, I was like, I got to leave my mark here. So I wrote a book about jellyfish, and that was called Spineless: The Science of Jellyfish and the Art of Growing a Backbone. And then this year, I published a book about coral reefs. And part of what came after I published that book is how this story that we're going to talk about came to be.
Right on. Before we get there, would you mind sharing how you got interested in ocean science to begin with? How did you get on
Yeah.
that path of studying using satellite imagery and stuff like that?
Well, I actually grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, so about as far from any ocean as you can be in the continental United States. So I really didn't grow up around the ocean. I didn't really know anything about it. But my junior year of college, I went on a study abroad program to Israel, and so that was about as there's lots of oceans around Israel, and I was actually pretty miserable on that study abroad program. I didn't fit in very well with the other students. I was unhappy. I was eating too many pitas, and there was like this sign on the wall that said marine ecology course 1 week in the Red Sea, and I was like, sign me up, get me out of here. So I went, and basically we got on this bus and went down to Eilat, which was a 5-hour bus ride, and kind of rolled off the bus. And these teachers in the course threw like snorkels and masks at us and said, like, go get in the water. And I was like, I don't know how, but anyway, you do it. And I put my head underwater, and I saw like these coral reefs. And I mean, I remember the thought that went through my mind was, how have I lived on this planet all these years and never knew that this existed? And it literally blew my mind. And then that whole week was kind of like, well, it was life changing. And I decided, oh, I want to study coral forever. But, life doesn't go in a straight line. So I came back to college in the United States, and I'm like, I'm going to be a marine biologist. But it was pretty late in my college career, and I took a biology class like as soon as I got back, but there was no way I was getting into grad school. And there were only a couple labs that studied coral at the time in the United States anyway. So there was no way I was getting into one of those labs. So I ended up studying satellite imagery because my undergrad degree was in math. So I had a little bit of expertise there. And that was kind of how I got my foot in the door.
Excellent. Yeah, that sounds like
That's a
an
long
amazing
story to the
experience.
ocean. But
All right, so once again, your latest story in Nautilus was The Mystery of the Healthy Coral Reef. Would you mind giving us a brief summary of the piece for our viewers who haven't read it yet?
yeah, it's I feel like it's one of the most exciting pieces I've ever written. Um, After my book was published, the Coral Reef book, which is called Life on the Rocks, this which tells the story of how the coral reefs around the world are really struggling, and then also what people are doing to support the health of coral reefs around the world. But after I wrote that book, this guy from Honduras just like contacted me through my website and was like, "Hey, I've got this really crazy healthy coral reef. You have to come check it out." And I was like, "There are no healthy coral reefs in the Caribbean. Like, what are you talking about?" And he's like, "No, no, no. My reef is different. You have to come check it out." And I was like confused, but also like, how do you not follow up on a lead like that? So we talked a couple times, and I talked to the only scientist who's really done any work there. And eventually in July of last summer, I went down. I went down to Honduras to see it because I just had to know if it was real. And it was as real as he said it was. It was the healthiest coral reef I've seen. And it reminded of me of reefs I used to see, you know, back when I first started looking at coral 30 years ago, even healthier than that. I mean, it's just an insanely beautiful, special place. And so the story is about this guy, his name's Antal Borgsack, and his wife, Alejandra, and how they basically discovered the reef about 10 years ago. And then how they created marine protected area, first local at the local level and then at the national level around it, but that the reef is threatened. About a few years ago, this Chinese company came in to set up a mining operation. And if they would have gotten the permits to do that, it would have destroyed this place. So Antal and Alejandra have come to the conclusion that if we don't know about these kind of treasures, then they are at incredible risk. And I think that's true. Like, if we don't know a treasure's there, how are we going to have any sort of teeth behind protecting it? So what Alejandra and Antal have done is built an aquarium, and it's the first aquarium in all of Central America, first public aquarium, which is amazing to think about. But it's just to get the word out. And so I really felt like it was an honor and a privilege to be able to also help get this word out about this place, which is super special. And maybe we can talk about what makes it so special. Yeah, also.
Exactly. I would love to. I mean, is the knowledge of this reef upending what scientists understand about the health of coral reef? I mean, if this was so surprising that it could exist in a kind of healthy state given the conditions that are there. I mean, a piece you describe like how surprising it is that I think one quote was like everything that could be bad about or be bad for coral reefs is present here. So how is it possible that the reef is doing so well?
Yeah, exactly. So this is one of the things is I think, the question is how could such, and this is not a small reef. Like I want to say, I don't think this made it into the article, but it's, about 30 miles across this bay, 30 miles by 20 miles deep. So it's not, there are miles and miles of coral. And so it's not like just a small little reef outside of a, hotel or something. It's really a big area. Um, and why didn't anyone stick their head underwater and look at it before the Borgsacks did is a really cool, important question. Part of it has to do with that river I was mentioning where the Chinese wanted to do their mining operations. It brings tons of sediment into this bay. And sediment is usually considered bad for coral because coral like clean, clear water. That's how they have evolved to exist. And so and that's because coral are animals. They're related to jellyfish and sea anemones, but they have this superpower, which is these algae that live in their tissues and photosynthesize. And those algae need sunlight, so they need clear water. And the reason why coral teamed up with the algae in the first place is because these kind of clear waters don't have a lot of nutrients in them. And so they tend to be places where there's not a lot to eat generally. But what these algae do for the coral is they photosynthesize, and then they feed 90% of the sugar they make from photosynthesis straight to the coral. So it's like, some people have described it as like having your own restaurant inside of you, or you can think of them as solar, they basically have solar, solar powered systems inside of them that create energy for them. Um, and so these murky places are generally not places where coral survive very well. Um, but in this place, they are. And, it's interesting to think about, because this is actually the place where, originally it was called United Fruit Company, but then became Chiquita, set up the Banana Republic. It started here in this bay. And Honduras gave them these concessions to set up a railroad that went to a dock. You can still see the remains of the dock in the bay, where, just boatloads and boatloads and boatloads of bananas were shipped out throughout much all of the 20th century. And so this is a place that also has had a lot of fertilizer, which is bad for coral. um, but the question is, which I kind of didn't explore because it's total speculation, is, was there something about this place being fertilized for the last 100 years that has given the coral there time to adapt to these more polluted waters, or these more nutrient loaded waters? And is the reef we're seeing out there like 100-year-old reef? Did it somehow die back when the Banana Republic was started in the early 20th century? And then are these the corals that can survive in these more murky, polluted waters? And is this the kind of reef we're going to see in the future as our seas do become more polluted? So that's like a lot of speculation. And I probably, I didn't feel comfortable putting that into an article, because the other thing about this place is there's been really little scientific research done here. Scientists haven't paid attention to it yet. Hopefully, this article will help bring more. Actually, it already has, because I reached out to a bunch of scientists for the article, and we're starting to look at some of the temperature signatures in this bay and find out that, yeah, it's just a different kind of place than we've looked for coral in the past.
Do you know of any scientists who have expressed interest or confirmed that they are going to go and set up a proper study of the area and of the reef?
I know of one scientist who, but I'm going to hold it tight because it could be a pitch for another story, right? But yeah, I do
Yes.
know of one scientist who's planning to go there this summer and take a look at the thermotolerance of the coral. So hopefully that happens. And it could be really interesting because, yeah, maybe there's, I mean, kind of getting into some of the more like nuts and, I don't know, like deep in the rabbit hole of this story. But so I
Mhm.
mentioned that coral have an algal symbiont that photosynthesizes for it. And what bleaching is when that algal symbiont leaves the coral, and then the coral doesn't have its food supply anymore, so it starves to death. And that's really what coral bleaching is. And it happens at elevated temperatures. Like about 2 degrees warmer will cause coral to bleach. But some scientists have been discovering that there's a different algal symbiont that can team up with the coral, and it can actually stay inside the coral above that threshold, that it has a degree and a half higher tolerance than the old symbiont, the original symbiont that coral have teamed up with for the last several million years. So the question is this new symbiont, has it already colonized the coral in this bay? And are they more thermotolerant because they have this other algae living inside of it? So that's one of the questions that hopefully this scientist will be able to look at this summer. And I
Yeah,
guess
I'd
I
be
might say
curious.
I have another article coming out in Nautilus about this idea of symbiont switching. So it's kind of a preview of
Oh,
another really
fantastic.
coral story. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll look forward to reading it in there. But I was just going to say I'd be curious to know what sort of consequences you'd see with substituting in the new symbiont? I mean, are can it can the coral reef more or less function the same as it did with the old symbiont, or are there important and interesting differences there?
Oh, you asked a perfect question. So yeah, this other symbiont, it only feeds the coral about half as much sugar as as the one that's less thermotolerant. So um, there's a lot of questions about like what will that mean for coral being able to survive long term if they're only getting half as much of the nutrition. Um, it's almost like I kind of liken it to having a tenant. So like you can charge your tenant higher, higher rent if your apartment is like in perfect condition and everything's working. But if the air conditioner is broken, maybe you can only get half the rent, but you take it because at least you have a tenant living there. And that's
Hmm.
kind of like the decision the coral might be making. But there's another piece to it, which is that in Tella Bay, where there is all these nutrients and stuff in the water, maybe there's food there. Maybe the coral makes up the deficit by eating more zooplankton, because coral can eat also. I mean, they're animals, so they have the ability, they have these sting cells just like jellyfish do, and they can sting little teeny zooplankton and eat them. So maybe they like make up the deficit in places where there's a lot of pollution by being able to eat food too. It's but
That's
this is
fascinating.
all just like speculation until someone goes in there and studies this. It's a really
Hmm.
interesting place with so many questions.
Is that something that you'd be interested in doing yourself, or just let some other scientists do it?
I mean, I'm not, like, so I'm a writer now and I don't have a lab or the ability to do those kind of measurements. But I can keep talking about it to other scientists, and hopefully some of them will get excited about it and do the work to find out why this place is so special.
Hmm. What were some of your first thoughts about how to start writing the story?
Um, well, I think that you know, once I went down to Honduras and stuck my head underwater and just instead of seeing just sandy bottoms with a few waving, soft coral around like I've seen in so many parts of the Caribbean, and I just saw these like miles and miles of carpets of hard coral and all these little teeny places for hit fish to hide. And then I mean around the edges of the bay there's just these jungles of coral that are critically endangered throughout the rest of the Caribbean, and they're just totally happy there. um, I knew that telling the story was going to be just a great delight. And then mostly what I did was I talked to Antal and his wife and kind of got some of the history of the place, because I think that the history plays a really interesting role in this place. Um, and then I reached out to there's really only one scientist who's done a lot of work there, and I reached out to him to talk to him about it. And then I reached out to some other scientists at Woods Hole Oceanographic who are looking for reefs that are thermotolerant, looking for these kind of super reefs, as they call it, um, to just kind of get a comment on, do you think that this could be that kind of place? So I kind of tried to craft the story from a let like here's what it looks like and here's what the people who are working there know about it, and here are all these questions that are fascinating and remain to be discovered.
Were there any difficulties you had in reporting or writing the story, or anything that was a challenge to get across to readers?
um this story was actually like a pretty joyful one to write, because how many times do we get to tell a good news environmental story? um I was hoping that I could have more scientific information on the reef to share, but if it just doesn't exist, it just doesn't exist. And so all you can do is pose
Right.
these things as questions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it, a good thing is to be able to be in that position where you are highlighting something that really should be studied more. And now scientists will have the opportunity to do that, like following up on your story. That's super cool.
I mean, we'll
Um,
see where it goes. I
so
hope so. I'm so happy that you chose it to have this video episode about it, because I think it just helps, get more the word out more about this place that's incredible and unique and very special.
mentioned some speculation about the possibility that fertilizer may have contributed to the evolution or the adaptive nature of the reef there. Was there anything else that um, didn't make it into the story? Any other interesting tidbits or anecdotes or ideas that you thought you might want to include but didn't end up doing so?
Um, that's a good question. There's another question about, yeah, there's another hypothesis. One of the things I talk about in the story is how there's this strange lack of disease in this bay. The Caribbean's been struck by many, many different diseases. The sea urchins, which are kind of a keystone, no, they not kind of, they are a keystone species on coral reefs because they eat macroalgae that can grow over the coral. And in the 80s, I think the 80s, there was like this incredible epidemic that just killed all of the sea urchins all over the Caribbean. And that's kind of the start of the end for the Caribbean coral reef health. But strangely, in Tella, um, there's these sea urchins every foot or so. You'll see them all over the place. There's also a ton of coral diseases that have spread throughout the Caribbean, and there's a lack of disease in this bay as well, of coral disease. And there's a really bad one just raging through the Caribbean right now. It's called stony coral tissue loss disease. And it just melts the tissue off the coral, and it affects about 20 to 20, maybe 2 dozen species of coral in the Caribbean, which is, you know, there's maybe 60 species of coral in the Caribbean. So it's about a third of the species, which is really crazy. Most diseases we think of as very species specific. This one is not. And it's really ugly. And it hasn't been seen on the reef yet in Tella. No one knows what the pathogen is, and it's really devastating disease. And then there was a big sponge disease that swept through the area, and these giant sponges that were 1,000 years old were all killed. And so, why is this place kind of disease free? And one theory, and again, this is some speculation, is that Tella gets like a meter of rain every year, and I mentioned that in the story. And there's when Antal was working on his aquarium last year, he told me that he just takes water from the bay and uses it in his aquarium, but he measured the salinity in the winter when most of the rains are coming down, and it was like typical ocean water is around 30 parts per thousand, 32 parts per thousand salinity, and this was 17, so not quite half. I mean, about half. And he put it in his aquaria, and his coral did fine. So he has a theory that maybe the coral can withstand these huge swings in salinity, but the pathogens that strike the rest of the Caribbean can't. And maybe there's something about the salinity, this washing out every winter, that protects the bay against disease. Again, total speculation, but pretty interesting to think about.
Yeah, that is fascinating to consider. All right, I
Yeah.
usually ask our guests what they're working on right now, but I think you already gave us a hint that the next one will be for Nautilus, which is very exciting.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell our where they can go online, a website or social media that we can all follow to see what you're coming out with next?
Yeah, my website is juliberwald.com. So no E on the Julie. That's the only trick. JuliBerwald.com. And there's a contact me page there. And I post all the articles I write and sometimes even write blogs. So you can check me out there, or it's just at Juli Berwald on Instagram and Twitter.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Julie, for your time. It was great talking to you.
Thanks, Brian. It was really fun.